Buongiorno a tutte e tutti. I will switch to English because our seminar today will be in English. And so we will have time, maybe after each speech, to synthesize for people with difficulties to follow English. So let me thank, first of all, our colleagues here, starting from Professor Bohle and Professor Meardi, and of course also Professor Blokker, Paul Blokker of our department, for having organized and for chairing this seminar. Unfortunately, we will not have Professor Pavolini with us because of flu, and so maybe another time we will gain the possibility to hear from Emanuele Pavolini, his interesting research. But for today, let me briefly resume the idea of these SDE lectures. The lectures of this year are organized on, let's say, a focus on the construction of welfare policies, how welfare policies become policies in action according to constraints, potentials, and the intervention of many actors during the implementation of the policies themselves. So this is our first seminar, having opened the lectures with the lecture from Professor Giovannini on the late October. It was a sort of open speech. And this is our first seminar, and the idea is to have a comparison between democratic systems, mainly in Western countries today, but in the sense of European Western countries, including also the Eastern countries entered in Europe. And so reasoning about how democracies in different styles of democracy have to do with the implementation of welfare policies, but we will enter later specifically into the theme thanks to Professor Blokker, who will chair, as I said. The idea is to verify, if possible, if having different welfare systems and having different democracy systems, we have different forms of effectiveness of policies in their implementation. Sometimes we think that our, let's say, old democracies are too slow, are too weak, and are not so effective in conducting their policies at the best implementation. And differently, some other countries, some other ways of being democracies are more efficient and more effective due to the fact that maybe they are, let's say, more direct, let's say, let me use this term, and sometimes they use some reduction of complexity through compression of rights, let's say. We will enter in this argument in a few minutes. So we will continue with some other seminars that will try to develop this perspective, and so coming from this comparison between systems and ideas of democracy, ideas of policy, going towards, and this is the second seminar in January, in the life cycle of a policy, looking at the information that are fundamental for constructing a policy, the different knowledge entering in the policies, and different also authorities, for example, for checking the capacity of having resources, financial resources for this later. But I will stop here, so not to boring you with some other details on this. So thank you again also in name of the director of this department, Professor Polino, who will reach us in a few minutes. Thank you again to our colleagues and speakers today. And so the floor is to Professor Blokker, and thank you so much.
Became the biggest party in the country, and in effect, one of the main reasonings and debates in current times is how should we define this act? Geert Wilders, the so-called Partij for the Vrijheid, Party of Freedom. What kind of actor is there also from a socioeconomic perspective? For instance, there was in one of the main newspapers a couple of days ago an article on how, where does Wilders actually stand in terms of the social question, in terms of addressing social inequality, social disparities, etc. In effect, still rather superficial perhaps, but research analysis shows that in terms of voting behavior in the parliament, Wilders most of the time seems to be aligned with a more left, social left type of position in terms of voting for indeed reduction of inequality, access to housing, etc., of those people that are at the more marginalized edges of society. At the same time, having, of course, a strongly radical right position on migration, anti-Islam, etc. And so this is just one example of a political force which probably don't have any clue, I have to say, what particular way will govern, in this case, the Dutch welfare system, so to speak. It's very unclear, by the way, what kind of coalition that might be set up in the near, hopefully in the near future. But it is clear that these types of actors, let's call them very simply populist forces, have specific relations to indeed social and economic policies. And by the way, as a scholar working on populism, this remains still a largely underdeveloped debate. What is actually the economic side to populism? What are the social economic impacts of populists in government, as we might want to call it? And it also makes me think of a recent book that I think is one of the more interesting contributions to debates on populism by Andrew Lorato and Gene Cohen, where indeed one of the core arguments is we can only understand this sort of populist wave if we clearly focus on the social question, if we clearly focus on how liberal, neoliberal policies have not clearly addressed questions of indeed social inequality, social marginalization. The Netherlands, again, is a really interesting example where, for instance, housing has been dramatically privatized in the last 5-6 years or so, leading to an enormous disaster in terms of access to affordable housing, particularly for young people, particularly for people who are still sort of trying to climb on the social ladder. And so that remains a kind of important, outstanding question, and I'm sure our two presenters today will help us a lot in addressing this question in their ongoing research also, which I suppose will be part of their talks today. One part of that is also an interesting and extremely important, I think, attention to the eastern or east central part of Europe, where for a long time, but not anymore, I suppose, we have been seeing the most important examples of center-right, radical-right populists in government, in power, having been governing, for instance, in Hungary since 2010, still in government in Poland, even since the last elections, but probably won't last long. Poland, in that sense, is a really interesting case study, which I suppose will emerge indeed. And so, indeed, in those contexts, one would look at this aspect, particularly indeed from, let's say, the recent experience of liberal, neoliberal driven forms of, let's call it, policies of modernization since 1989, and the effects on society, and the effects on indeed on politics, forms of backlashes, etc. But again, we clearly, we know it also from the Italian context, we equally need to look, of course, at what we normally call Western Europe, where we see increasing, we can name basically any country right now, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain, all have sizable, increasingly important right-wing conservative political forces, either in power or close to power. And so, We're extremely honored to have two speakers, indeed, again, unfortunately not three, two very renowned speakers with clear, high standing in international debates also on political economy, social policies, comparative welfare states. And one of the reasons also I contacted them was their clear interest recently in, indeed also this political dimension. The relation between economic and socio-economic policy making with specific ideological positions, so to speak. And one example that has been often used is, of course, the Law and Justice Party in Poland and its so-called 500+ child benefit program, which was now supposed to be turned, by the way, 800+ next year. I'm not sure if the Law and Justice Party will be able to pull that off. But it really raises the question, indeed, is this more left-oriented socio-economic perspective of some of those populist forces, is that also an explanation for their success? Is it what makes them successful in mobilizing the electorate? Without further ado, I will introduce the speakers, and then we have the honor to listen to your interventions around these themes. I'm really curious. First, here on my right, Professor Dorothee Bohle, who is now Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Vienna. She is an expert on comparative political economy, has for a long time worked on East Central Europe, on various cases, particularly Poland and Hungary. She has also in the past been, when the Central European University was still East Central European properly, when it was situated in Budapest in its entirety, she was professor there at the Central European University, as well as more recently at the European University Institute in Florence, or actually in San Domenico. She has widely published on varieties of capitalism. That's one of the reasons I know her quite well. Indeed, in relation to East Central Europe, specific forms of capitalism in East Central Europe, issues of neoliberalism, and more recently also relations between the COVID-19 pandemic type of emergency policies, particularly Hungary and Poland, are really interesting there, I guess. And even more recently, something that directly taps into also what I work on myself, the EU's rule of law crisis. Which again shows its relation also between the more political, legal, and the socio-economic. Then even further on my right is Professor Guglielmo Meardi, Professor of Sociology and Work and Economy at the Scuola Normale Superiore, which is in Pisa, but I suppose you work predominantly at Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. Also Dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences. He has for a long time been Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, where he was also Director of the Industrial Relations Research Unit. He was, and I suppose still is, Editor-in-Chief of the European Journal of Industrial Relations, right? Has widely published on industrial relations, trade unions, recently also on what I find particularly interesting, the issue of familialism, how do you pronounce that, in welfare systems, welfare chauvinism. And I dearly recall, that's actually the way I came across your work, an older paper, I think from 2008 or so, on Solidarność, the Polish trade union, which remains one of the fascinating parts of Polish history, I would say. In that sense, I would also say anyone who manages to go to the Gdańsk and go to the museum that is now in the shipyard where Solidarność mobilized, it's a wonderful place, I have to say. But without further ado, I'm actually not sure what kind of order would we. Is that okay with you? Okay with starting off?
Yeah, it's fine. Okay.
think I have to sit, although this means I'm a little bit. It's really awful. No, okay. Sorry for this. So I will sit. I hope I can see you this way. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me in this extremely interesting, broad topic and debate. It's also my first time that I'm ever been at the University of Bologna. I'm very happy to be here. It's an amazing place that you have here, and I'm really looking forward to the exchange. So I don't know how much this was advertised, but the topic that I had a different topic initially. So the title has changed, which now the title is Making Sense of Populist Social Policies in Poland and Hungary, Ideology and Context. And the interesting thing is when I was listening to what is the aim of this debate here, I realized that actually it fits much better than what I had originally in mind. So I'm very happy that apparently I aligned with the overall debate without knowing it. So let me tell you a little bit about the background. I'm not really working on populist parties. I don't like to call them populists. I call them radical right parties. For the context of this presentation, I will always call them populist radical right parties. But you will in a way see that populism matters to these. It's the radical right story that really matters. I have this paper comes together. The presentation comes together from two different strands of my research. So on the one hand, as Paul said, I'm a political economist, and I've been recently thinking much more about how comparative political economy, I don't know how familiar you are with this, like varieties of capitalism, growth models, how they tend to forget the whole sphere of social reproduction. So it's all about production, productive capital. They never look at how basically workers are being produced, the education system, female workplace, etc. And so that is one strand of research. And another one is a paper I'm currently struggling together with a co-author, Niels Oellerich, to make sense of economic policies of these populist radical right parties. So what I'm doing here is basically to put the two things together. And I should say one thing in addition before I start. What I'm presenting today has been very much inspired by a recent book, a forthcoming book by Meardi on how the radical right shapes capitalism, welfare and capitalism in Europe and the US actually. And I will tell you more in detail where I build on him, because I think it's as you know, I'm a comparativist, so it's a wonderful comparativist way of thinking about different policies, but which basically follow from similar ideologies. So what I want to, so basically where I'm starting off is, I've been in the framework of the second paper I'm currently working on, I've been following quite intensively in a way the debates on what shapes socio-economic policies of populist radical right parties. Right? So there has been quite a big debate starting in the 1990s, but going on until now. And the interesting thing is that the East European stories, in my view, don't really fit into this. So the Western debate is a lot about welfare chauvinism, etc., and Eastern Europe has none of this, right? So I was thinking, so how does this debate basically translate to Eastern Europe? Can we find something, or are there specificities? So I will introduce first the debate as I see it, and then second, and this is really building on Philip Radke's work, adding a nuance to the debate, which is it's not only I will make two arguments. The first one is ideology matters, and it matters for all these populist radical right parties wherever they are, and it's a similar ideology, but then policy context matters as well, and that would be basically if you want varieties of capitalism or welfare states, right? And the policy context is what shapes the policy impact to the real outcome. And I will walk you through this theoretically, but then also empirically. I will illustrate this a bit. And then I will end the talk with giving you some unintended consequences and new challenges for social policies of these populist radical right parties in these countries. I can also say Fidesz and peace, right? So, okay, let me start with the debate. So I think we had, as I said, the debate on populist radical right socio-economic policies, what shapes it, is one that has been around for a very long time. And the first explanation was the one, and which was really very, very famous for a very long time, by Kitchell and McGunn in 1995, where basically the argument was that neoliberalism and cultural authoritarianism are the winning formula. So, and basically, Kitchell and McGunn had in mind that populist radical right parties, on the one hand, have an electorate of the small business owners, the petty bourgeoisie, not so much really or parts of the working class, but they were catering to their cultural authoritarianism. So their idea that the working class is actually not very, or parts of it at least, is not very democratic. And this was challenged, I think most famously by Müller in 2001, when he elaborated broader on this issue of the social economic policies, because he said, actually, if we now look at, we have a proliferation of populist radical right parties across Western Europe. All of this debate is mostly related to Western Europe. So we have a proliferation of these parties. The one thing that you cannot say is that they're neoliberal. They are everything else, right? So they are all over the place with their economic and social policies, but they are certainly not neoliberal. So what he was basically saying is that social economic policies don't matter for the electorate. That's not what the electorate cares about. The electorate cares about cultural issues, so-called cultural issues, especially migration. That's the big thing. And so they can be all over the place in social economic policies, but they have to be focused in anti-migration. This again doesn't bode well. So the next wave of the debate is basically one which started from the mid-2010s onwards, and it has a lot to do with that we have increasing number of populist right-wing parties. Radical right parties in government, at least as coalition partners, or they, even if they're not in government, they're becoming more important overall. So the argument here that people realize, or scholars realize, is on the one hand they cannot, when they become bigger parties or come to government, they cannot stay silent on social economic issues. They have to tell something to their electorate, right? It has to be substantive. And so what was recognized from then on is that social economic policies are a salient feature. They matter. These people, and this is a little bit what goes into the direction what Paul was saying at the beginning in the introduction. So there is one strand of this literature that comes up saying, look, because they get also increasingly strong support from the working class, which is also, you can trace it over time, they basically turn leftwards. And this is basically, in a way, your argument. I have serious doubts on this, but I will talk about this. So here, like Afonso and Renwald, but many other authors basically argue that, okay, they, given that they are increasing workers' electoral base, they need to cater to them, and the way they do it is becoming more leftist in terms of redistributive policies, especially welfare. It's a chauvinism, but still it's welfare policies, etc. Or it's basically the old style welfare policies, right? Not the new social risks, no social investment, and these kind of fancy things, but really this old style, early pension, early retirement, and giving something for the deserving working class. And the other strand in the literature makes the opposite argument, and that is the one that I would like to transport to Eastern Europe. And that says, yes, social economic policies matter, and there are salient features, but they reflect the radical right core ideology, namely nativism and authoritarianism. And so the nativist core of radical right populist ideology translates into welfare chauvinism. So that is not left wing, right? If you have welfare chauvinism, it's basically against migrants having the same rights, or refugees having the same social rights as natives. And authoritarianism translates into this discourse, into a traditional moral discourse, a discourse of deservingness, and a moralizing and deservingness discourse. And then so it's certain groups in the society that have a right for social policies, but others certainly not. And this can then have a cultural dimension as well, so who do you exclude and who not. But the target here is the traditional manual working class and those who work hard. And so the unemployed, women with children, single mothers with children, etc., that's not part of the story. So in that sense, I think this is not left-wing. Even if there is redistribution, it is not a left-wing type of redistribution. So that's the main point. Now, how does this debate, or these phases of debate, travel to Eastern Europe? And here I look only, I should say, East Central Europe. I should even say even more the Visegrad countries. And at the end of the day, we are talking about two countries where, as we know, the populist radical right has been in power for very long. It's Hungary and Poland. So how does this translate? And there's several things that I think we should think about. So the first is, it seems that Hungary and Poland go very different ways when it comes to social policies, right? So in Hungary, and also the debate, in Hungary we have a lively debate for understanding the social economic policies of the Orban regime. And this is mostly kind of reiterating the Kitschelt argument, but from a more leftist Ramschi perspective. So here the argument is, on the one hand, because Hungary basically dismantled the welfare state as we know it entirely, so you don't have social rights anymore as a worker, as an individual. And it has also labor rights are being dismantled, etc. So the argument here is, on the one hand, we have neoliberalism in the economy and also when it comes to welfare state. But we have populism. So for these authors, populism is important, but populism is this cultural type of populism, is the way how you appear, because these authors, so Scheiring and Faber, they certainly argue that the support, the electoral support for Orban comes from the disgruntled working class, those who face deindustrialization. And basically what these authors argue is that populism is basically to give the workers the cultural kind of tropes that they would vote for them, like anti-immigration, etc. But it is not something that has a material impact, right? So this is the Kitschelt front. In Poland, we have, I don't think you call it leftist, but you certainly, so in Poland, what we certainly see, what the literature tells, is that there is a strong redistributive element in social policies when peace came to power, and I think Guglielmo will talk more about. But there is especially the role of family policy rather than social policy. And I think one of the important, so here the argument is it's very different from Hungary because here we have extensive social policies, but they come in the form of family policies. And you get some authors, that's not Guglielmo, but others who really say it, who claim it's a leftist kind of appeal, right? So what we see from this debate is, on the one hand, that Hungarian, Polish, radical populist right parties' social policies differ. And in the existing debate, and none of them confirms this ideological explanation that I gave you as my last one, so saying it's the core ideology of nativism and authoritarianism that basically shapes it. So if you read in Poland, often what is mentioned as shaping the more general social policies may be Catholicism or something like that. But again, that doesn't travel to Hungary, which is not a majoritarian Catholic country. So anyway, so it seems to not fitting anywhere. So the point I want to make is that I think there is a way of making a very clear argument that the ideology actually matters in both countries. And it's the radical right ideology, and it also makes these social policies more similar than they look as we think about in the literature. So this is what I said, and I really hate that I cannot stand because. Okay, no, but that's stupid. So that's here. I really built on Philip Radke's book that is forthcoming 2024. And what he basically does in that book is an encompassing comparative book which looks at social policies of radical right-wing parties in the Scandinavian countries, in the US, in continental Europe, so conservative welfare states, and in the Visegrad countries. Now we interpret the Visegrad countries differently. That's my small innovation, but the framework I think is very helpful. So what he adds, he says, okay, so the core ideology of nativism and authoritarianism clearly shapes the substance of radical right-wing parties' social policies. But then it is mediated, if you want, by the specific policy context, or he calls it also welfare context. It's more difficult for me because there is not such a thing really as welfare context in the Visegrad countries, so I'm not very consistent here. But the policy context, so you have an ideology, but then you basically have to work within the constraints and opportunities that are given. Let's put it this way, right? And this shapes then what he calls the policy impact, or basically the concrete policies, if you want. So I give you only here, because I said his work is much more comparative, I only give you the conservative welfare states, so basically continental Europe. So what shapes then, what is the policy context? We have large-scale immigration in most countries. We have a declining industrial workforce. We have a rise of non-traditional family models, and we have a number of new so-called social risks. And this means, in this particular context, nativism translates into welfare chauvinism, just because they are immigrants, right? So you can basically say you don't want that the immigrants get welfare. So that is a very different story. Or that cannot happen in a context where you don't have immigrants, right? Or what is then welfare chauvinism? So then also in Radke's terms, the authoritarianism translates into this idea of protecting the deserving parts of this, and this deservingness discourse, protecting the deserving parts of the population, and taking away benefits and not extending benefits to the non-deserving parts of the population. I already mentioned it's mostly about the hardcore workers, traditional proletarians, so these manual workers basically, and they are protected. And you have basically, in a way, authoritarianism also translates into familialism. So the idea that it's basically all the care work has to be done within the family, and it's not the state that has to give it, and it's basically reinforcing the traditional model of the family. Okay, in Eastern Europe, or in the Visegrad countries, the context is radically different, and therefore the type of policies that we see are also different. So the context is we have economic dependency, meaning these countries are basically highly dependent in their economic models from Western capitals. So the literature is also called FDI dependency. So these are dependent market economies, if you want. All the parts, everything, from industry to retail to everything to banks, is in the hand of foreign capital. Which means globalization does not come through immigration, but it comes through economic dependency, right? That is still an argument that Radke makes. We have no immigration. I mean, we had until recently, let's put it this way, little immigration. but the possibility of immigration, right? I mean, latest with the refugee crisis, these countries could have, of course, had much more immigration if they wanted to. So it's a possibility, it's a threat that is possible, but it's also little immigration. So we cannot have welfare chauvinism. We have massive immigration on the other hand, and shrinking populations. These things go hand in hand. So we have, if you want, a demographic crisis that again these governments react to, and we have, for socioeconomic reasons, low labor force participation. So this translates into a different type of policy impact or concrete policies. So the argument I'm going to make is that we don't, against this background, we do not have social protection, but we have industry protection. So industry is being subsidized and reindustrialization is being subsidized. So these countries basically foster, if you want, jobs rather than social protection in the industry. We have generous family policies, so we don't have social policies, not very much, but we really have, it's the family that's the unit of, that's addressed. So it's not the workers and their social rights, but it's the families and to produce children in the national interest. And we have extensive family policy. And I will now illustrate this on the two examples. So the industry protection instead of social protection. Here I just reiterate what I said already. So Fidesz really, the Hungarian radical right party, really dismantled social welfare and social protection radically. And actually already in 2010, it promised to create a society based on work instead of the uncompetitive Western type of welfare state, and promised that the latest by 2018 there will be no need for benefits in Hungary because we will achieve full employment. Right? So they were very explicit. To my best knowledge, this was never as radical in Poland as in Hungary, but it is also not that PiS came to power and said we want to give better social protection for existing workers or social rights. It was never about rights and also not really protection. There was a bit more of basically making jobs more stable. There's a lot of, minimum wages being increased and so on, but that's all not protection and that's all not social rights, right? So they don't have, in that sense, a welfarist agenda either. But instead, what both of these countries did is to foster industrial development, traditional industrial development. So I give you here again two quotations. The first one is when Orban came to power, where he basically, again, he was very outspoken. So the argument is the new Hungarian economic system must be based on the principle that replaces speculation. Hungary was very much a victim of the financial crisis with production. That means work and value creation. So that and work and value creation is only happening in industry, right, in productive industry. This basic principle should prevail in all measures and legislative proposals that we propose. And the PiS party manifesto from 2015, here again, the Law and Justice Party believes that the state's task should be to create development strategy and mobilize resources to get out of the middle development tracks. The whole point here is in Poland, this whole development and focus on manufacturing basically takes a more developmentalist turn. In Hungary, it's more just getting more and more industry. But in both countries, governments basically said we need to build the industry. And what you see here on the picture, I mean, Hungary now is trying to become the EU's biggest electric vehicle battery manufacturer in Europe. And it does so by inviting investment from Korea and China. But this is basically catering to the German car industry. I will not spend too much time on this picture, on this figure, but the point is we often hear that basically Hungary and Poland have engaged in economic nationalism. Now that is not really very much the case. So what we should know about the industrial protection, if you want, is that in the industry, so manufacturing industry have been subsidized heavily and have been subsidized more heavily by these populist radical right governments than by any government before. So the manufacturing firms get more subsidies in order to come and to stay. And here on the right you see, so the blue line is basically how much of that industry or the subsidies go to German firms. And German firms is important because they are the core of the manufacturing hub in Eastern Europe, right? So the fact that more than half of the subsidies of the Orban government go to German firms, and even Poland under the PiS government it's 40%. This is also higher than their liberal predecessors. So you see in subsidies, and one could have more indicators for that, you see very clearly a focus on manufacturing industry. Also, what you see here is, in comparison to Germany, you see the employment in industry as a share of total employment. And you see that Hungary and Poland are the green and the blue lines, and Germany, which is the most manufacturing-intensive country of the EU, of Western Europe, sorry, you see a constant decline of the share of employment. You see a rise again in Hungary and Poland. And on the right side, you see the same. The blue line is Hungary's, that's the male population. You see also the strongly gendered workforce in the industry. Hungary is the blue line and the orange line. So the share of male employment in manufacturing is the blue line, the orange line the share of female, and for Poland it's the grey line and the yellow line, right? And you see the gendered aspects of manufacturing and employment, which also is part, of course, of why this populist radical right parties like manufacturing is productive work done by women. And this, as a last empirical slide, you also see that indeed Fidesz, I don't have the data for Poland, and these data are actually, again, from Hardgate. You see the strong working class base of Fidesz. So Fidesz has a strong working class. It was around, so this is this upper black line, this is manual workers. Production workers who was around 35 to 40%, and then if you add the service workers, which is the grey dotted line, you get more than 50% of the electorate of Fidesz is actually working class, right? So it all speaks to the working class base, but it also speaks to a policy that is not social protection, but industrial protection. Okay. Then the next part of the story that is more known, so I will be briefer, and I think you might talk more about it. It's that we have family instead of social policies. So I really don't, I mean, I will be very brief here, but the basic argument here is that so we have redistribution both in Hungary and in Poland, but it is redistribution, and it's a different type of redistribution. So in Poland, we indeed have redistribution of money to the poor, but this mostly comes through this family 500 plus program, which was then extended further, which gave a minimum income for 500 zloty per child initially for families with lots of children, and by now I think every family that has a child gets that money. And that has led to really a redistribution and also towards the poor, and this is part of the story, of course, why PiS has been so popular, right? But it is family policy. It is tied to basically having children and family. It's not a social right. There is almost no social investment, and then we have the almost complete abortion ban, which is another story that basically, I mean, if you think about the economic repercussions of abortion, it means that women have much more difficulties to enter the labor market. So all this looks also like a very traditional policy that pushes women back into home. In Hungary, the story is I mean, even if we have ultra-conservative family policies, the concrete policies differ. So we have, I start also with the family policies. We have very generous family policies, but they are for the upper middle class. And this is the reason, it's very, very simple. Hungary has a sizable Roma minority that they were the one who had a lot of children, and of course Fidesz didn't want to racialize family policy, right? So we don't have the redistributive aspect that we see in Poland, but the main idea is the same. We need to basically create more native children, and native in this case only means Roma and non-Roma children, right? Ethnic Hungarian children. So that's the main target. Yeah, you also have explicit feminism. So basically, women are increasingly demanded to do all the care work. It's now also written in the constitution that also for the next generations, etc. So the care has been privatized to families. And this is something that Eva Fodor has called care fair. So basically, women are forced to do care. But they are in addition, and that's a difference to Poland as well, they are in addition forced to do wage labor. Not forced, but they have to do wage labor because all the family benefits are tied still to women also being in the labor market. So it's not independent, and there's a difference there. And then you have workfare. So there's in Poland, because of the redistributive aspect of the family policy, so the poverty is erased differently. In Hungary, you have workfare, but you had for very long workfare for the Roma population. It's racialized workfare. Okay, I come to the end of what I want to say with just a couple of remarks of that. This, of course, so the main argument, as you could see, hopefully, is to say that it's a radical right ideology that shapes the policy outcomes, but they are different from the West and partly different from each other because of the policy context. Meaning variety of capitalist welfare state that they were implemented. Now I come to this has consequences, right? So we talked about already distribution. There are more consequences of this particular type of social policies, and any new generation of radical right or whatever will have to do. So the first one is the aim of relegating women back to the home, which is stronger in Poland than in Hungary, just didn't work. So what you see is in both countries a rise of female labor market participation, right? In Hungary, this was desired because that was that was the plan for women. In Poland, it was not desired. But what you can see, and I think this is also the case in Italy or wherever you go, you cannot just push women back to the home anymore. They will, for many reasons, work. So, and with this, you of course get, for women, you get the double share, right? You get the care work all being pushed on them, plus labor market participation, often at more precarious conditions. So that is the outcome for women. This is only for the employment for the data for Hungary, but Poland should look rather similar. So you see that this industry protection, if you want, and of course also the macroeconomic situation, led actually to a very highly declining unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is now between 2% and 3% in Hungary. And at the same time, you get that one on the right side. And that on the right side is the permission for foreign workers. So how do you plug the holes? And how do you plug it? Women is one way of plugging the holes. So there's increasing labor shortage. How do you do it? You bring in foreign workers. And this is one of the most paradoxical outcomes of this. If you foster industry and workplace, you get into the massive labor shortage, and then you have to plug the hole. And although you are a government that really rails against immigrants, you bring them in anyway. And this was not lost on Tusk, right? So I give now the examples from the recent electoral campaign, elections in Poland, when basically Tusk said, why is Kaczynski simultaneously setting dogs on foreigners and immigrants by wanting to let them in by the hundreds of thousands from such countries? And such countries means non-European countries. So what we see now on a quite massive scale, both in Poland and Hungary, is immigration or guest workers from mostly Asian countries, right? And it's visible. And this is just one example. This is the Orlen factory that is in Poland, that is building basically a huge expansion, all with workers from the Philippines, from India, etc. And they had to justify themselves a lot. And the idea, I mean, those of you who don't know the Italian background, but I remember the German one. Certainly, the idea in the 1960s in Germany was, yeah, you bring in guest workers, but they don't bring out their families, right? So they don't, and, you know, that was the beginning of basically migration and towards the multicultural society. But anyway, so this is, so we end up with social, very productivist social policies, or policies. No, we don't have social policies. We have a productivist and pro-family, natalist pro-family policy, and what we end up with massive worker shortages, which then basically need to be filled by migrant workers that the same governments rail. And this is already, I come to my conclusions. I think, because I repeated this already several times, I only want to focus on the last conclusion. So yes, we have a departure of neoliberalism in both countries. It's not a left-wing departure from neoliberalism. It's a feminist redistribution or state intervention. It's industry protection, really more than status development of industry. But what we end up is across the board with more precarious positions for the workforce. And the workforce is one which is gendered and racialized. So we have labor market insiders that do not have social rights. They are insiders maybe, but they are no social rights. We have women who have increasingly to fulfill the double load of care and wage work, and typically also, I mean, the care work is clearly not regulated. Wage work depends on where they work. And I think the most appalling story that we will see coming out increasingly is the newly imported migrant labor that is basically, you have temporary agencies that bring them in. They're basically, it's the firms that have the right to govern how this labor, where it works, where it lives, how it works, etc. And they have no right of staying whatsoever, right? So and that is basically the outcome now, not the output, but the outcome of radical right social policies in Poland and Hungary. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this. A lot of things to be discussed there. I think it's really interesting enough. No. Already myself, a lot of these questions. But I would ask you, if that's okay with everybody, to leave the substantive questions to after Professor Meardi's talk. So we have a larger Q&A session for debate. If there are any immediate questions for clarification or something like that, we can still take them right now. I suggest, I'm not sure if somebody had something that didn't add up. If not, we just go ahead with our discussion, particularly looking forward, if I'm not mistaken, given what Professor Meardi, looking forward to your talk and then also to the debate afterwards.
Thank you. Now, I will also try to find the right position. I can't stand. Now, I will talk only about Poland, so it's a bit more focused, my presentation, but with some comparative insights about whether this, let's say, ideal type of conservative, familiarist social policy can be exported, can be imitated, can be followed also in other places. Some comparative with Hungary, because it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with Dorothee, Bohle, and that's a great opportunity to be here. Also with Italy, I was expecting to discuss it with Emanuele, but I guess other people will want to say something about that. Now, in 4 points what I'm going to say today. First, I try to explain the curve of social policy in Poland in 2015-2023 during the 8 years of the Law and Justice government, which should come to an end next Monday. We'll see, because they may prepare a surprise. This period was a part of the populist wave, Trump, Brexit, and so on and so forth, but had a distinctive, strong social policy element that challenges the populism literature, the right-wing populism literature. The second point is that I tried, theoretically, to say that there is a strong importance of discourse in policy change. This is a case of policy change, of a rupture with the trend of the welfare policies in Poland, and the discourse was very important. Not exactly the ideology, but I would say more specifically the discourse. I stress, therefore, that the discourse was focused on the family, and potentially this also can be valid in some other contexts, maybe even in Italy. And fourth, I will discuss the last elections and why. I will make some arguments which are similar, but also some additional arguments to what Dorothee said about the unintended consequences and the limits of this social policy, and why, after 8 years of success, so let's say, it is coming to an end. Now, to explain what I'm talking about. Red is Poland, blue is Hungary, grey is the total of the OECD, so all industrialized countries. And then social expenditures as a share of the GDP. The big line is when the populists come to power. The little one is for Hungary. You see the populists come to power, social expenditures go down. Poland, the populists go to power, social policy goes up. It may look like there isn't such a big difference, but try to remember, if those who are into social policy know that, a lot of expenditure in social policy follows automatism. So it doesn't take new decisions. Just you have a system for its unemployment benefits, then if unemployment go up, if you do nothing, all these social expenditures go up. So I think that the increase is very significant because in this previous period, more or less these years, unemployment in Poland was about 20%. In the period under Law and Justice, unemployment is about 4%, 3-4%. So you would expect the opposite. Social expenditure to have been extremely high in the 2000s when the left was in power, and to be low now when the right is in power and unemployment is low. We see exactly the opposite. But if we look more with the magnifying glass where the social expenditure is, as Dorothee already said, it's largely the biggest item is family cash benefits, and that is where Fidesz went to power, in Hungary went down. Dorothee explained, because if you just give it automatically, the Roma get it, and you don't want to give any automatic money to the Roma minority. In Poland, it jumped up. It's nearly 2% of the GDP, so quite a lot of money. It's a record in the OECD. Now, the literature. According to the literature, this puzzle of Poland is not so easy to understand. First of all, most of the political science literature on populism, hasn't paid much attention to social policy. No? And when it does, it focuses on this welfare chauvinism thing, which in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, until recently wasn't particularly salient. It didn't matter very much. Maybe it's starting now. However, it's quite clear that since the financial crisis, the social policy demands have been more and more important in politics, and also for political competition, including for far-right and populist parties. We still don't know very much because most of the literature is either on the opposition populist parties. I mean, when you're in opposition, you can say whatever you like. Or on coalitions with pro-market conservative parties. For instance, the Austrian one, or in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and so on. In those cases, the main party is the mainstream liberal right-wing party, and therefore you can't really tell what the right-wing populists would do if they had the whole power. To see that, you have to go to Poland or Hungary. From the more detailed, more recent literature, I also like what Philip Ratsky say, but I also had a lot of discussion. When I wrote an article for a special issue, he edited it. You have to say that Poland is like the other ones. No, Poland is not exactly like the other ones. So we had a little bit of discussion. According to the main literature by Radskip, or a review that I've done with Manuela Caiani or Immergut and so on. Well, when they do social policies, these parties, they focus first on pensions because their voters are older, they have worked for a lot of time, they were largely either manual working class or anyway in the male full-time employment scheme. And they have little attention to labor market policy. These two things don't fit with if they do fit with they fit with Poland only to some extent. Also, if they do labor market policy, these parties would be very much pro-insiders. Also, this in Poland doesn't really fit very well. They did also a lot of things for the outsiders, unlike in Hungary. Other points which fit very well with Poland in this case is the familistic natalist policies, as already Dorothee mentioned, and the little attention to services, more specific. So, just one slide to put Poland in context for those who have never been to Poland or know anything about Poland and so on. They have had a specific parts in policy, in economic policy, and in the political culture. They had the shock therapy, the ideal type of radical, immediate shift from communist economy to pro-market economy, which have really shaped the debate and, let's say, the whole institutional setting of Poland. And also in terms of political culture, I'm not a culturalist, so for me this is a symptom of something, it's not a cause of something. That's really very interesting. It's by far, on basically all items, the more pro-capitalist country in the world. Okay? And the second one, but far behind, is the United States of America, and then you have Korea, Japan, and so on. Italy is somewhere more on the anti-capitalist side, let's say. So, why does this mean? Why is this important? Sorry, what does this mean? This is a much scope for social democratic social policies in Poland in general. Now, this is what Law and Justice did from 2015. I don't have the time to go through the details, but very clearly on pensions, they lowered the retirement age, with the previous Liberal government had taken it higher, in particular for women. Okay, for women that was they reduced by 7 years for women and 2 years for men. They improved the employment protection legislation, also for atypical workers. So this is where Philip Ratzinger said, no, this is impossible. But they did it. I mean, I can't deny that they did it. They improved the minimum wage, especially for casual workers, especially for part-time workers, but in general, they more than doubled the minimum wage and introduced the hourly minimum wage. Previously, there was only the monthly one, which didn't help very much the part-time. And then we get to social benefits. There is some, they kept discussing improving the benefits, unemployment benefits. In fact, they stayed on line. They kept promising to never deliver on that. They introduced some benefits for activation and relocation for people to change jobs and go somewhere else. And welfare chauvinism, well, there was some restriction on seasonal work permits, but in fact, as Dorothee said, there has been a record. Poland has had the record for the last 3 years for extra EU immigration. And people think, oh, it's in Ukraine, even without Ukraine. So think about how big it is. So they don't talk about it, but in fact, on conditional seasonal work. And then finally, the big thing, okay, what I'm going to talk more about, the child benefits, the 500 plus. At the time of introduction was the most generous child benefit of the whole OECD. At the beginning, it was only from the second child onwards, and then from 2019 for every child. Initially, it was means-tested, so the richest wouldn't get it, so the social element that Dorothee already explained. Then again, it became universal. They also changed something in education. That's an important thing. They brought the age of entering primary school from 6 to 7. That's a very conservative, familiaristic thing, to keep children in the house, in the family for a bit longer. But at the same time, it is a bit more complicated to understand or to expect. Let's say they invested a lot in preschool education, nursery, asili. We are in Emilia Romagna, so that. that mentioned the Emilian model. They really massively increase the provision, very interestingly, mostly by private. So the state provision went down, the private provision went up massively. So there is a right-wing market element, but there is also this huge investment in child services. How did they do it? I'm an industrial relations person, so let me also say whether they negotiated and so on. In Poland, there is this strange thing that they also committed, the right-wing government committed to social dialogue. At least on paper. In practice, it's been extremely little and bad relations, especially with the employer associations. They promised to strengthen also collective bargaining, but they never delivered. And most policies were actually unilateral. They were not negotiated in the tripartite convention. But what is very interesting is that there was a very strong collaboration with one of the two large trade unions in Poland, probably the most active, which is Solidarity, extremely close relations and collaboration. So it's a rare case of a right-wing government supported by a trade union. Even the left-wing trade unions has been mostly appreciative of what this government has done. In a way, has had a better relationship with the law and justice government with the previous liberal Tusk government. And even in the first 4 years, two of the deputy ministers, those responsible for social policies, were from Solidarność. That is, they were, until the day before coming to government, were leaders of Solidarność. They entered government. So the relations was very, very direct and personal. Now, to the point that one could interpret the Polish case as a case of neo-Peronism. Peronism was a kind of let's say, authoritarian, but also very paternalistic, political tendency, which included the organization of workers, a very, very important aspect. And there are some aspects. These are, by the way, they have the same surname, although they are not married. This is the leader of the trade unions, the president, and in both presidential elections, he was officially endorsed by the trade unions. They didn't do it in the parliamentary elections. They can't endorse a party, but endorse the president, which is also very, very important. Now, the explanation of this, why this happened, in particular, I think the electoral strategy was very important. Law and Justice was created in the early 2000s as a right-wing split from a previous coalition, right-wing coalition into Solidarność. And initially, it wasn't focused on social policy at all. It was focused, actually, the manifesto in 2005, when they first won the election, was based on cheap state. That is, had a very minimalistic state policy to lower all social expenditure, lower taxation and lower expenditure. So it was much more a Tea Party kind of thing, much more Trump rather than social democratic. In 2019, the title of the manifesto was a Polish welfare state. So the title of the manifesto was the welfare state. So that was a huge shift. And the shift was because the electoral strategy changed. Rather than trying to make a coalition of right-wing forces, which was the strategy in the early 2000s, they absorbed the previous far-right parties, in particular the League of Polish Families, which existed in the early 2000s, which is extremely conservative. And an alliance with the fundamentalistic Radio Maria, which is a radio in Poland, which also in Italy we have Radio Maria, but the Polish one is worse, okay? Yes, it is. And it's 10% of people listening. It's not a lot, but it's 10%, okay? They listen every day. But above all, the most important thing was they managed to mobilize those who had been in Poland long-term abstainers, people who didn't used to vote. Electoral participation in Poland was extremely low, and Law and Justice managed to win the election for 2015-2019, not by convincing voters of other parties. That happened very, very little, but by convincing people who had never voted or hadn't voted for quite a lot of time to come and turn up at the elections. So the trend in 2011 still had lost, with 29% on the 48.9% turnout. 2015-2019, not only their vote increased and they managed to get a majority in parliament, but also, despite never having 50% of the vote, but also the turnout goes up quite massively. And this is the new electorate was from the small towns, which are quite particular. Why are they particular? Because these new voters are both poorer and more traditional. So they didn't target the working class in the big cities or the new poor in large cities. They target the poor in the countryside and a little town. And for these people, they need both substantial elements, that is, they need a social policy, and the discourse to make them understand that it was them delivering the social policy. For these voters, both the symbolic and substantial elements are important. There's some very good research on exactly what happened in Poland in the little towns. So this is why you have to understand law and justice in the little towns or little villages. And then how did they do it? With familiarism. Familiarism is, let's suspend the disbelief whether we like it or not. It's a coherent discourse. And this is why the discourse is very, very important. It's also in continuity with Polish tradition. It's coherent because basically you can say, if the government helps the family, okay, then the family is more stable. The family provides care, so you solve the social problems, provides care for when somebody is ill, when somebody is without job, and so on. Also, the family will have more, but women will have more children. If you have more children, then you will have more people in employment. Then you also have more people's social contributions, and you also have the pension system being better, and you can pay especially elderly women to retire early and to be good grandmothers and help the mothers to have even more children. So you see that the circle is a virtuous circle, it improves. Also improves so much that you have so many good people at work, you don't need immigrants anymore, and you have a better society because everybody's squeezing, everybody's Catholic and Polish, and therefore the economy also goes better because there are very good, skilled, properly Polish-speaking workers. The economy goes better. There is even more money for the state to reinvest in family policy because they don't need to spend it anymore on the traditional social policy and social services because there is always a grandmother or somebody else looking after the children, the elderly, and so on. So whether you like it or not, it is a coherent discourse that basically no other party has to that extent. No other party has even tried to make a reasonable argument that puts together demography, social care, economy, public budget, and immigration. So here I would use Vivian Smith's approach on discursive institutionalism, where the discourse is very important for two reasons. First, it coordinates between actors. So the people start talking about things in the same way, and then it communicates, it convinces people in a coherent way. The coordinating role is very interesting in law and justice, it's very visible in how strongly they interact with the church on one side, with one of the trade unions, Solidarity, and therefore the labor movement, let's say, workers. And subsequently, after they entered government, the media, they were really aggressive on this. It's quite similar to Hungary, very, very aggressive on taking over all the media and government agencies. That was really striking because in my recent visit in Poland, I was used to civil service in Poland, which was quite independent, and now they clearly can only say what the governments want them to say. And this has therefore been a rare case of successful institutional change. Why is it successful? Institutional change is a change that makes even those who didn't like it to accept it, to the point that it's very difficult to change. When the 500 plus was proposed, it had universal opposition by business, by the employers, and by all other political parties. It was too expensive and too conservative. And Poland will never afford it, it will be an economic disaster. But it hasn't been an economic disaster, if you like it or not. And now it is approved by all political parties. Even during the election, they were trying to say, oh, we will make it even better, rather than make it even worse. So it's in that sense, clearly, a discursive success. And another very interesting thing, which has been observed by some people who have done in-depth research on the electorate of law and justice, the most common statement about law and justice is of the kind, this government steals, but at least it shares. So that it reminds a little bit of some Italian governments in the past. Okay, but let's say this part of the social policy, which is very important, is instrumental, but somehow also they see some moral value in it, even if there have been a huge amount of corruption scandals in the last 30 years. Now, Why? But now I try to conclude about why this cannot be sustained. The first point is demography. Okay, the 500 plus was meant. The main reason was to increase the birth rate, also to fight child poverty. On child poverty has been a success, I would say. Child poverty was a scandal in Poland. The economy, the fastest growing economy in Europe, and it still had large extent of child poverty. But on birth, this is important. So you have some the green are the births, and the red are deaths. Okay, the blue is when 500 plus was introduced. Sorry. That is the number of births in thousands. Okay, so yeah, the absolute numbers. Yeah, so it's not a percentage of anything. After it was introduced, you see a few months later, but it takes a few months. There's been a little jump, the green one. Okay, but then it's been declining. After it was made universal, it collapsed even more. There is the period of the pandemic, of course, where the red goes out of scale for the deaths, but also we know that everywhere the pandemic has lowered the birth rate. It's been a collapse, and Poland is now one of the fastest aging countries in the world. As Dorothee said, you can't force nowadays in contemporary society to women to not to go to work. You also cannot force them to have children. You can, Iran has an extremely low birth rate. You can have as conservative a government as you want, but women are changing their attitude, and it's not 500 zloty which will make them change very much. And culture is changing very much. Now, let's take from the European Value Survey 2 questions. In 1990, 60% believe that working mothers damage children. Okay, if a mother goes to work, there will be a damage for the children. Now it's 13%. 56% believe that men should have more employment security than women, and now it's 8%. Still too much, but you see the huge cultural change that has occurred. There is a growing anti-clericalism. This reminds me very much of Ireland in the 1980s. Because the amount of the most terrible scandals you can hear in the news in the last couple of years. But in behavior, and it's not only in opinion, the civil wedding, the civil marriages have just overtaken the religious one. That is a huge change in comparison to only 20 years ago, when the huge majority had a religious marriage. And those who attend Catholic Mass, go to communion, also they've been falling quite sharp. So that pillar also is fair. And the turning point, I would say, already Dorothee mentioned abortion, was the counter-mobilization. So that is, by making the family the most important thing to mobilize the conservative part of the society, they had the effect within 5 years to mobilize those who have different ideas about it. And that was the biggest movement really in Poland since the fall of communism was in 2020 after the full ban on abortion, the strike, the women's strike. Right, so we come to the very end, the election in Poland in mid-October. What is interesting? Law and Justice had managed, their strategy was on raising the electoral participation of people in small towns and villages. They had succeeded. Now, what has happened is that the turnout of youth has increased massively, from 46% to 71%, and that has been decisive for the election. So and largely it is because that family discourse is not acceptable for those who have very different values and experiences. Here we have the distribution of the vote among young people. It's very interesting. Law and Justice only have 15%. The left is, which is very weak in Poland, only has 80% overall, is the largest party among young women. It's quite unique, although it's still weak again among men. And we have this, I think, unique in the electoral behavior in Europe, this huge gender difference in male and female voters, because among males, young males, the most popular party is the very far right, the one even to the farther right of law and justice confederation, which wants women not to have the right to vote. Okay, so that's so it's the opposite. The opposite is true. If you find young people, more than 1/3 of the males voted very far right, but more than 1/3 of the women vote for the left. And the other interesting thing is that by a little, law and justice lost one of the many things, I would say, that made it exceptional among right-wing populist, far right populist party, that is, it had more female voters than men. Usually they're very male overall. But in part it is because confederation, the very far right took the most male chauvinistic voters. That's interesting. So, conclusion. I would say that the family discourse and the social policy, both are together, were decisive for the law and justice, both in the strategy. So it's quite clear from the manifesto that was not by chance. That was a decision to focus on familiaristic social policy, and as a result, as a driver of people going to vote. So both for material and discursive reasons. In part, there's a very good article by Nacek and Heimanis, who also compare Poland and Hungary. They focus on the labor alliance. And that is in part of the story is the labor alliance. But I would say that law and justice has not just been pro-labor, it has also been pro-family. Pro-labor is that far, I wouldn't say leftist, but I would say pro-labor, at least in comparison to the previous documents. So what is emerging? How can we define this kind of social policy? I would use the social paternalism term as populist social policy, which can also be seen in many elements in the emerging economies from Brazil to Turkey to India and so on. This social policy is based on the simplest possible messages, usually with an eye-catching number, 500. In the case of Italy, a comparator would be quota 100, something relatively easy to understand, to hear, even if then in practice it may mean something else. Cash transfers rather than services, and unilateralism plus selective union collaboration. Now, can this happen also in other countries, or is Poland an extreme case? Well, Poland is an extreme case, but I would say that countries with strong conservative religious actors and with a tradition where the family provides welfare and provides support to the labor force, to the labor market, can have this element. So I saw many similarities in the program of Lega Nord, and Serbia, for instance, an Orthodox country, has been analyzed in a similar way by Orestein and Bogacic. However, it's also inherently unsustainable in the long term because demographically it doesn't work. So it fails on a pillar of the circle. On migration, because the demography of migration is not affected in the way it is proposed, and cultural change. Recent research shows that although 500 plus is popular, it's not hegemonic anymore. It's more and more important for people also healthcare, the experience of the pandemic, and care for the elderly. Still in Poland, there is no support for a social democratic welfare state. Therefore, what may happen next if law and justice is kicked out of government next week is both two things may happen. One is the radicalization of the right. Now the migrants are there, they can go harder on the chauvinistic, down the chauvinistic, anti-Muslim, anti-whatever route, or a liberal welfare perspective. Liberal welfare, by liberal welfare I mean liberal in the sense of promoting in particular female occupation. More like the UK, let's say, rather than like Sweden or Norway. I don't think there is demand for social democratic welfare. Thank you.